Welcome back to Wally on the Weekend. Today in the studio we have a special guest, Carrie Beauvais. She is an author. Carrie, great to see you. Anxious to visit with you this morning.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, so Carrie, you have won. You are an award-winning author, and I understand you've run an Arizona Book Award and something that I really know about, at least the author, the Hillerman Award. So quite an accomplished author. Just talk a little bit about your body of work with those awards to get us going.
Okay, well, those awards were for a book that I wrote called Girl with a Gun, and it is an Annie Oakley mystery. And so I started the series with that book, and it sort of is a take on Annie Oakley's young life when she started to become famous.
Yes.
And I've taken a little bit of liberty with the timeline. She's 15 years old in the story, which was indeed when she met and married her husband, Frank Butler. But she didn't join the Wild West show until she was 26. But for the sake of the story, I wanted to have her join the show and meet Frank all at the same time. So that's the first book in the series, and she joins the show, and her Indian assistant, Native American assistant, a young woman, is murdered, and so she sets out to solve the crime.
So, historically inspired novel?
Yes.
Now, is the crime itself, is that fiction, or
It's
is there
fiction.
Yeah. You took off on the character, and then just tell us about the awards. The Hillerman Prize, Tony Hillerman, one of the top, probably two most famous New Mexico authors. So
yes.
yeah.
And I was a huge fan of Tony Hillerman, and in fact, when I was first starting out, I wrote him a letter, and he wrote back.
Yes.
And it was really wonderful. He was always very generous that way, and just for some advice. But for the New Mexico Arizona Book Awards, there's a number of categories that you can enter. And I entered the mystery crime category, and Girl with a Gun won that category. And then they gave out 5 special awards, and the Hillerman Award was the award presented to the book that garnered the most points in fiction.
Yes.
So it was a huge honor. It was quite a surprise. I was blown away by it, and I was just so honored to have an award with his name on it.
Congratulations.
Thank
that is
you.
absolutely fantastic. Now, talk to us about your writing career. How long have you been writing? How did you get your start?
Well, I've been writing for a long time. I've written stories since I was a little girl, and majored in English in college, and finagled my coursework so that in my senior year I could take 3 independent studies, and so I took and I could create the courses. So I did a playwriting course, a screenwriting course, and a short story course. And so it was just myself and the professor, which was wonderful because I got to set my own schedule and all of that. Graduated from college and got a job as a writer, a technical writer for a Fortune 500 company.
Okay.
And so that was a totally different kind of writing, and for a creative writer it was a little bit soul-sucking.
A stifling endeavor.
It was, but and my stuff was just edited to death. And but it really helped me to be more economical with my words, and it really helped me to develop a cleaner style, which that's one of the things I get complimented on, is that I have a very clean style. My books are a fast read.
Yes.
Yeah. So
well, in technical writing, there's a scene from MASH where they're disarming a bomb, and so the thing is, cut the red wire, and
Right.
they cut it after you cut the blue wire. So the point of technical writing, and not that you were doing bomb disarming, but it has some very stringent requirements.
It really does.
Yes.
And so it was, It was great, and it was a really great experience. And then after that, I moved to Houston, Texas. My husband and I became engaged, my fiance at the time, and we moved to Houston, Texas, and I taught some school, just in small Catholic schools, and always was continuing to write. But it wasn't until my children were little and we had made the decision that I was going to stay home that I really needed that intellectual outlet.
Yes.
And I met a wonderful writer, and she was teaching classes out of her home. And she gathered a bunch of us together. I think it was like $15 a week or something. And I was able to get out of the house and pursue writing and novel writing, which I had not done before.
And this is like the writers group where you bounce ideas or get feedback on how things are going. So
right. So the way it was structured was we'd write something, we were working toward our novels, and she would critique it, and then we would all sit around and critique each other's work. So it was wonderful.
Well, talk to me a little bit about the process of critiquing for people who are existing writers or might fancy themselves putting pen to paper. It seems like there's I don't know how to describe it. It's like you certainly want feedback, but it can't be too much too soon, or it can be just crushing for people as well.
Right. I think that it's a double-edged sword, because while it can be very affirming, you can learn a lot from people, you can learn a lot from their comments, you can learn a lot from giving feedback as well. But what happened to me was I got to a place where I lost my voice. There was all kinds of different voices in my manuscript. And because
you're listening to too many people?
Listening to too many people. And we also did exchanges where we would actually write on each other's work.
Yes.
And so after I had an agent who finally said to me, you need to just have the guts and the courage to do this on your own, because you can do it.
Right.
And then hire an editor. So that's what I've been doing for the past several years, is I will write something. I have lots of writer friends, but we don't exchange work anymore.
Right.
So I just go ahead and hire an editor.
Yeah, very good. Now, you talked a little bit about your college experience with screenplay, and much of your work, just looking at your Goodreads page, tends to have some Western themes with female leading characters. Talk to me. Anybody looking at doing movies, the screenplay thing? What's your approach to that? I know some authors just recoil at the thought. Some are like, yeah, that may not be bad. Has there been any interest, or have you done any work with regard to screenplay? Because it seems to me like in this kind of streaming video, you have the blockbusters that are hundreds and hundreds of million, but it's like it seems like more of a market for different genres of stories that maybe wouldn't have had as much of opportunity, and this seems like a fantastic one to me. So,
well, yes, and it's interesting that you asked that question, because I am working with a couple of producers here in town. It's an all-women company called Whippersnapper Productions, and we are working on putting together a proposal and a lookbook to pitch to potential investors to make a television series.
Yes.
And so right now, to save some money, I have done, some screenwriting before. The pilot has been written. I co-wrote it with someone, and then now I'm going to be writing the next episodes. I think there's 6 or 7 episodes that will go into this lookbook.
Yes.
So that's
that episodic format, with streaming is that's where a lot of good action is happening.
Right.
Yeah. So when I just glanced at your work, I was thinking, the Legend of Buster Scruggs, which is is the only similarity is it's slightly episodic and Western theme, I was thinking, well, some of these characters might make a good screenplay, and would be really interesting to see if that gets made into a movie or a streaming series.
Very colorful. I mean, it would be, big sets, big crowds, because they're performing, on horseback. It's just, it's going to be really fun.
Yes.
I can't wait to see what develops.
Well, and then authors that have had their works made into screenplays or movies, then when you come back here in a few years, I'll ask you, now, how was it? Did they take it and they twist it so much that you were cringing, which that does happen from time to time as well. But it's interesting, the creative process of taking a core work and turning it into a screenplay.
Right. Now, these women really want my involvement. Which is so nice.
That's fantastic.
They're like, we want you every step of the way. You're the creative behind, all of this. So, what a wonderful compliment, right?
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Now, talk a little bit about some of your other books, the characters in there. I see one here that is Peccadillo at the Palace. Talk about that.
So that is when the Wild West show, it's the second book in the series, and it's when the Wild West show goes to England to perform for Queen Victoria during her Jubilee in 1887.
Wow.
And Buffalo Bill's Wild West show did indeed go, and Annie did meet the Queen, and she performed for the Queen. And so I thought it would be really fun. I'm a huge Anglophile. I studied English history and literature in college. So it was a great way for me to combine my love of English history with American history.
Yes.
So it was really a fun book to write.
Well, and that is interesting, is to, you get, it's almost like a blending of genres. You have all of the Southwestern and kind of Western themes, but then you have to go to another country, so you have to see it through you have to see the whole different country through the eyes of your characters. So.
And I bring in some of my favorite people from history, English history. I bring in the Irish poet Oscar Wilde. He makes an appearance in the book. The socialite Lily Langtry, who was mistress to Prince Albert, who became King Edward.
Yes.
And so some of those really colorful, fun characters I brought in. So that was neat.
All right. Now, some of the other books we have here, we've gone over Shoot Like a Girl. Great title. Where's that in the series?
So Shoot Like a Girl was actually written after Girl with a Gun.
Okay.
And I had to take out a really, I think, a really important part of Girl with a Gun. It wasn't important to that story, but it was important to Annie's story. So I decided to make those scenes a prequel novella.
Okay.
So it's about 80 pages, and it tells the story of a time in Annie's life that was particularly hard for her. And she never spoke about this experience a lot because it was painful for her. She was farmed out to another family to help make money for her own family. And I think she was 11 or 12 at the time. She might have been a bit younger. And this couple was quite abusive to her. And she never named them in all of her life except for to call them the Wolves. And I thought, wow, this could be really, a really interesting way to show sort of Annie's past and how it affected her. And in that story, she meets Buck, her horse, who becomes pivotal in her life and who becomes sort of her lifelong companion. And so it was also a great way to highlight how she would become interested in truth and justice. Yes. As an amateur sleuth. So it was a great way to use that story to segue into her wanting to fight for those who can't fight for themselves and to also find the truth. Because she had experienced the downside of that. Yes. Well, we're visiting with Carrie Beauvais here, author, award-winning author, and living in the Albuquerque area. Now, I have to ask, just because we are here talking on the radio,
any audiobook production and any plans for any of your books to be done in the audio format at this point?
Actually, that's on my list for 2020.
Okay.
I don't know that I'll get all of them done, but I'm trying to decide. There's two different platforms, if you will, that you can go on, and I'm just trying to decide which one would be best. One of them is called Find Away Voices,
Yes.
and the other is, of course, Amazon ACX.
Yeah.
You can do it through Amazon.
Yes.
And there's ups and downs, goods, pros and cons to both.
Yes.
And so I'm just trying to sort through which would be the best option.
Yeah, and then the other question is, as you sort through that option, I have some familiarity with the audiobooks. The other thing is do you see yourself doing the read, doing the production, or do you see someone else doing it, or is it a little early to tell?
I get that question a lot, and I really would like to have someone else do it, only because, especially with fiction, I think if you're writing nonfiction, it's important for the author to be the voice.
Right.
But fiction is really, it's like a movie, or it's like a theatrical production, and these people that do the voices are trained actors, and I think it just adds a lot more to the story if you have people that are trained. I am not trained, so that would be a whole nother learning curve for me that I just don't have the time or really want to take the time.
Yeah, and there's a whole different way of doing audiobooks. So you're right, it's a production, it's very akin to acting, but there used to be there in the early time of audiobooks where there would be, multiple readers, but now it seems like there's one reader, but you have to have enough differences in voice to give the different characters. Right. So men do the women characters, women do the men characters, but just enough that it's the different character, but not such, like if a man's doing a woman where it's just this annoying falsetto that makes people want to turn off the book and not listen anymore. So yeah, it is quite a skill. So yeah, I know the author Craig Allen Johnson, who did the Longmire series. I happened to watch the series first, and then it's like, well, I wonder. They said from the Longmire series, it is interesting that how different the books were from the actual video production,
right?
But how much better, actually. So as much as I actually love the Longmire series, Wyoming is played by Northern New Mexico, and Las Vegas plays Absaroka County. But as good as that series was, man, the books are better. So I'm going to read your books first before they're made into movies. So
I think you have some time.
Okay, you never know. It's one of those things happen. So.
Right.
So talk a little bit about your process in writing. How do you chart out your plots? How much work do you do outlining, and then how do you there's a saying, how do you apply yourself? How do you make sure that you're making progress? Some authors have to have so many words, so many pages before they do anything. What's your approach on the big picture, and then how do you deal with it day to day?
Well, I'm usually inspired by something in history or a person in history, and then I do a lot of research, and that's really the fun part, is doing the research. And so I, go on the internet, I look into books, I talk to people that might have had experience with this particular place in history or person in history, and then once I get sort of the bulk of the research done, then I start writing, and I write maybe 50 pages before I get an idea of what I want to do with the story. And then it's
just to sort of get going, is that right? Yeah.
Right, just to get past that blank page. And then I'll go through and I will map out the major plot points,
right.
The structure of the story. And start, then after that 50, 60 pages, readjust and start writing in earnest. And then it always happens. A character will say or do something that I wasn't expecting. Yes. You sort of like when you get into that zone, your subconscious takes over.
The muse speaks.
Right, right. Or I'll be writing something and I'll think, oh, I wonder wonder how this would play out. And then, of course, I look it up to see if anything like that happened, how I could apply it. So my research and my writing kind of dovetail in and out of each other at that point. So I research as I go, I write as I go, I change as I go. I try not to mess with the beginning too much until I'm really deep into the story, because it could change.
Right.
So that's kind of how I go about it. And then once I finish it, I walk away from it for a few weeks and then go over it again.
So if you have, a first draft, if you will, you're more likely to rewrite the beginning than the later. Is that a fair statement, or there's some of each in the process?
A lot of times when you start out writing a novel, you're more than likely starting in the wrong place.
Okay.
And so you have to kind of flesh out the whole story before you can determine, okay, is that the right place that the story should have started, or should it have started 15 pages later, or am I not far enough into the story yet? So it's kind of one of those things that, it seems like every novel I've written, the process is a little different.
Yes.
It's very hard to just say, this is how I'm going to do it. Some people are extensive outliners, like 60-page outlines. Other people sit down and they just wait for the muse to speak to them, and they just write. And that would be called the pantser, as opposed to the plotter.
Right.
And I consider myself a puzzler, because I'm puzzling it out as I go.
Yes. Now, do you try to write for a set period once you're in the middle, or how do you, what is your discipline, if you were? And, and some authors are pretty lackadaisical. It's like, I write as much as I want to write. It just seems to happen,
When I get really into the story, I try to set aside 2 to 4 hours a day, 5 to 6 days a week, to either be continuing to plot. Maybe I'll, tweak some things. It doesn't necessarily mean that I am pounding it out on the keyboard for that 2 to 4 hours. It could be, thinking about it in the car, and I'll talk into my phone, or I'll send myself, text messages or whatever if I come up with an idea. So it really does, it kind of takes on a life of its own, to where when I'm really working on a story and I'm into it, it's hard for me to walk away from it. It's always there, and that's really exciting, and it's a fun, you get to be in another world. I mean, which is really cool.
So it's more of the story is pulling you, as opposed to you having to whip yourself forward to write.
Right.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
Yeah.
Now, you've talked a few times about research, and a lot of people are surprised to know how much research most authors, not all, but most authors put into fiction. So, they do research to make sure it, what are some of the reasons, the ones that I'm just vaguely aware of, you want it to be somewhat historically accurate, at least in the big rocks. There's lots of great ideas and characters that come. Are those important, in what other things does research do relative for you doing your novels?
I think what research really does is it puts you in the time period. And so you want to be accurate with the clothing. You want to be accurate with some of the wording.
Right.
You can't write, as if you're living in the 1800s, because we just don't speak like that anymore.
Right, and go back another century, ye merry old, no one's going to want to listen to that.
So you have to have some sort of, you have to have contemporary language, but you can pepper in words through dialogue, or when you're in someone's thought process, you can sort of say things. You can't use, current slang.
Right.
So I look up slang from the 1800s and try to put that in. But sometimes I've noticed with some historical authors, it looks like they're just throwing in those words to say, okay, I know, this is the time period, and I know that these words were used in the time period. I think it could be overdone too. So it's just a fine balance,
Yeah, it's forced, if you were, to words. And I think from a historic point of view, as there's the observations of little things in their day-to-day lives sometimes are what really brings you back to that period as well.
Right.
A lot of the Western things that that I've read that really resonate with me. It's like really interesting process. One of my favorite New Mexico books, and I don't know if you've ever come across it, is one called The Black Range Tales by James A. McKenna, and it's a book about the silver and gold rush period of the late 1800s in southern New Mexico. And when I first picked it up, I was the printing was almost that scholarly 1920s, technical manual, and I thought, well, maybe I can weed my way through this. Well, it's a historical tall tale is the thing, so the exact opposite. But the point of that is that he has some observations from attitudes and things they do on a daily basis that he doesn't need to necessarily use the exact language that was done early in his life, but you get the sense that you're really there. So that's the point of that. So.
Because I think people want to go back in time. They want to be immersed in that time. But you have to reach them, in the time that they're in, right? So you have to reach them through your language and through everything, but also create that world for them. So it's a lot of world building, really.
Yes.
And just create that world where it rings true.
Right. Mm-hmm. Now, talk a little bit about Annie Oakley and your research. Are there some primary sources of research that you either went to early on or you continue to refer to that are nonfiction or other inspirational fiction works about her in terms of getting started with your projects with her as a main character?
I saw a PBS American Experience special on her, and this thing was put out quite a while ago, and I watched it, and actually it was recommended that I watch it by my father, and he said, I think you'll really find this interesting. And I had never really considered Annie Oakley much more than like this cartoonish goody two-shoes kind of character.
Right.
And so when I saw the special, it was really amazing to me how much depth this woman had. Her difficult background with her difficult childhood. Her father died when she was very young, and so her family was quite poor, and she had to help her mother. She started shooting game to help put food on the table, ended up being able to sell it. She was farmed out to this other family. There were all these things in her life that made her really interesting to me. And the fact that she was this young girl who was, she never grew above 5 feet tall. She was this teeny tiny woman, and she, made her living with a gun.
Yes.
And that was very interesting to me. And another thing that was interesting to me was she was raised Quaker, and she ended up becoming a huge celebrity. And Quakers, from what I understand, no one is better than anybody else. There's this level of equality and this modesty that they live their lives, in the way in which they live their lives. And here she was, this celebrity. So how did she reconcile that?
Yes.
So I looked into a lot of that. And the research, there's a wonderful resource called the Buffalo Bill Archives on the internet, and it's put out by the Cody Center of the West.
And that is
in Cody, Wyoming.
Okay. Yep.
I have not been to the Center of the West yet, but I would love to go. And so there were just tons of articles about the Wild West show, about Buffalo Bill, about Annie Oakley. So I got a lot of information from that. And my husband also bought me a first edition biography of Annie Oakley that was written in like the early 1900s. So it was very close to her time period. And so that was more, I just did a little fact checking with that book because I had the bulk of the story written. And so when I got a hold of that book, I just kind of, just validated what I had researched. So that was really, very affirming to me.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not exactly sure how to ask this next question, but in this kind of modern internet connected age, there's these communities that develop. So is there the Annie Oakley at large group of people that are just totally into that, and do they like you? Do you interact with them? First of all, does such a group exist? And second of all, what's your relationship with that?
I think there are groups like that. I haven't been in contact with too many of them. There is the Garst Museum, which is in Ohio. It's the Annie Oakley Museum. And it's funny, with some of the reviews I've gotten and some of the feedback I've gotten, people are very protective of Annie Oakley and Annie Oakley's image. And the fact that I have played with some of the facts bothers people.
Yes.
It really does. And at first I was kind of taken aback by it, but then I understand it, but at the same time I've never claimed to be writing nonfiction. I've never claimed to be writing a biography. So I think there are groups out there, and I've been in contact with some people who are very who know a lot about Annie Oakley, and they love the books and they think they're great, and it was kind of like thanks for bringing this forgotten heroine back into the modern day consciousness and everything like that. And then other people who are a bit concerned with some of the things that I've made up.
Yes, and there's this concept in psychology, I believe it's called anchoring. So the first thing you read, everything after that, you kind of would compare to that. And on certain things, there's certain even certain fictional characters. Sir Arthur, for example, it's like, well, that's not what Sir Arthur did. It's like he was always a fictional character. It's like it would seem like there should be a little liberty with that. In your case, you're not trying to be totally historical accurate, but it is interesting that people get attached to characters, I guess, is what happens.
That's a good way of saying it.
Yeah.
And, even historians, I am no historian. I love to do research, but I am no historian. But even historians, they have their own biases, and they have their own how they put something out into the world might have a little bit different spin than someone else who's studying the very same thing.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So you're listening to KIVA Radio Wally on the weekend, and we're visiting with Carrie Beauvais about her fine body of work. Carrie, it's really fun visiting with you. I do have a few more questions. If you've got just a few more minutes, what are you working on now? What is there a book out there? I know you're working on some screenplay work and other things. Is there another book in the series that's under construction right now?
Actually, it is. It's with my editor right now, and it is called Folly at the Fair, and it's when the Wild West show goes to Chicago for the Columbian exhibition.
Yes.
And so Annie, it's 1893, and Annie and Frank have been married for a while. Annie's a bit burned out, and there are some things that happen. A long lost friend appears and is in trouble, and so Annie gets involved in that. So.
Well, very interesting. And then also, we are New Mexicans, and we are part of the great Western tradition. Are there some scenes in any of your books that kind of take us through parts of New Mexico, or is that
actually,
beyond what was historically accurate or able to be put in your books?
I think that Buffalo Bill did come through and stayed at a hotel in Cimarron, and there's rumors that Annie Oakley was there, but they did make an appearance in Colorado. Buffalo Bill's buried in Colorado, all of that. But no, not in my books. I don't bring them into New Mexico. However, I have a Southwestern mystery that I've written that I hope to release next year, toward the end of next year. And that's about an archaeology student who stumbles upon a secret society.
Okay.
So, yeah.
And that would be set at least partially in New Mexico?
It's set completely in New Mexico.
Okay, very interesting. And, we it does not have to be set in New Mexico to be great fiction, but it is always interesting where that comes about. So, and then finally, what are some of the ways people can get a hold of your book and books, and what is the way that you prefer the most? What's the way you like to have
Probably
it?
Amazon.
Yeah.
You know, they can get a hold of my books through Amazon. They are in bookstores. Sometimes you have to order them.
Right.
But I like Amazon, and I also like to get reviews on Amazon.
Okay.
So that's a really important thing for authors and for books, for the life of a book, to have reviews, as
Yes.
many as possible.
Yeah, that's that
Yeah.
whole internet thing. So those
Yeah.
good reviews or insightful reviews, they can and do live on Amazon
Yes.
for months and years, and
Yes.
who knows? This
Right.
internet thing's pretty early, but some of those reviews could live 50 or 100 years into the future.
Right.
And if somebody has a great review that's insightful, and you can
Right.
tell the ones that are fake, pretty
Right.
not always super easy, but some. But if
Yeah.
somebody has some very specific comments about what they like, you're like, oh yeah, that might be worth a try. So,
Yeah.
all right, very good. Any final thoughts? Thanks for coming on Wally the Weekend. It has been fantastic visiting
Well,
with you.
I really enjoyed it. Thank you so much.
All right,
Yeah.
that's it for this segment of Wally on the Weekend. We're so glad you're listening and hope you stay tuned.